The ground trembles beneath the feet of kings as a tide of desperate voices rises from the fields and alleys. This is the hidden history of peasant rebellions that brought empires to their knees. Picture this, a world where the poorest laborers, the overlooked farmers, the nameless masses who built palaces with their sweat, suddenly stood up and said, "No more." Across centuries and continents, from the frostbitten villages of medieval England to the sun-scorched rice paddies of feudal China, ordinary people ignited fires of revolt that burned so bright they nearly consumed the crowns of the mighty. How did these uprisings, often dismissed as hopeless riots in history books, come within a hair's breadth of rewriting the world order? Behind every rebellion lies a breaking point, a moment when hunger outweighs fear, when injustice becomes unbearable, when the sheer weight of oppression finally snaps the patience of thousands. These weren't mindless mobs, they were movements with strategies, leaders hidden in plain sight, and grievances as old as civilization itself. Whether sparked by backbreaking taxes, stolen harvests, or the casual cruelty of nobles who saw peasants as little more than livestock, each uprising carried the same explosive potential. Some lasted weeks, others years, but all shared one terrifying truth for those in power. When enough people decide the system cannot stand, even stone castles begin to crumble. What you're about to witness are 25 tipping points in history where the unthinkable nearly happened, where the ruled almost became the rulers. We'll walk through moonlit conspiracies hatched in wine cellars, brilliant tactical maneuvers by farmer generals, and the heartbreaking moments when victory slipped through calloused fingers. These stories reveal more than battles. They show us the raw power of collective will, the fragile illusion of control held by kings, and the universal human longing for dignity that no crown can permanently suppress. By the end, you'll never look at a wheat field or a marketplace the same way again, because beneath every peaceful society lies a tension, a silent question. How much longer will the people bear the weight of the throne? The answer, as history shows us, is sometimes sooner than anyone expects. The summer of 1381 burned with rebellion as England's fields emptied, and the roads to London swelled with furious voices. This wasn't just discontent, it was a wildfire of defiance spreading from village to village, uniting peasants who'd reached their limit. At the heart of it all stood two men: Wat Tyler, a blacksmith turned military leader with a knack for strategy, and John Ball, a radical priest whose sermons asked the explosive question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? His words gave theological weight to their cause, turning economic grievances into a moral crusade against the very idea of nobility. What made this revolt extraordinary wasn't just its scale, over 60,000 peasants marching on the capital, but how terrifyingly close they came to success. When they breached London's gates, the Tower, that ultimate symbol of royal power, fell into their hands. Imagine the scene: common farmers and craftsmen dragging the king's treasurer and other hated officials to execution on Tower Hill, their blood soaking the same ground where nobles once strolled untouched. King Richard II, just 14 years old, had no choice but to meet them at Mile End and make promises abolishing serfdom, capping rents, granting pardons. For 3 dizzying days, England's feudal structure teetered on the edge of oblivion. Yet history remembers this moment as much for its tragic unraveling as its initial triumph. At a second meeting at Smithfield, fate turned on the edge of a dagger. Whether it was a misunderstanding, betrayal, or the rash act of an angry peasant, Wat Tyler found himself cut down by the king's men. Without their leader, the movement fractured like dry kindling. The young king, showing sudden political cunning, rode forward shouting promises to the crowd, "I am your captain, follow me." Diverting their rage while his nobles prepared a brutal backlash. Within weeks, the revolt's hard-won concessions were revoked, John Ball hanged, and the old order reasserted itself with violent force. But here's what most history books overlook: the trembling fear that lingered in royal halls long after the last rebel was executed. For generations, English nobles whispered about 1381, not as a victory but as a warning. The peasants had proven they could organize, march, and even dictate terms to the crown. Their demands fair wages, an end to forced labor, representation echoed down centuries, resurfacing in future revolts and eventually shaping England's slow march toward democracy. The revolt failed, yes, but it planted seeds in minds across Europe. If peasants could nearly topple one kingdom, where else might the ground shake beneath the thrones? France in the year 1358 was a kingdom on its knees, ravaged by the 100 Years' War, bled dry by taxes, and terrorized by roving bands of unemployed soldiers. The nobility, safe behind castle walls, demanded more from starving peasants while offering nothing but contempt in return. Then, like a spark hitting dry tinder, the countryside erupted in what would become known as the Jacquerie, a rebellion so ferocious it sent shivers through every noble house in Europe. They took their name from the mocking term Jacques Bonhomme, the noble's slang for a simple peasant, but there was nothing simple about their rage. Within days, thousands of farmers and laborers armed with scythes, axes, and stolen swords turned on their oppressors with chilling precision. Castles, those impenetrable symbols of power, went up in flames as mobs dragged lords from their halls and executed them in the open air. The rebels even developed a battle cry that cut to the heart of their grievance: "Death to all nobles." What made the Jacquerie different from other uprisings was its sheer speed and coordination. Without modern communication, rebel leaders somehow organized attacks across multiple regions simultaneously, proving that peasant networks ran deeper than anyone in power had imagined. At its height, the revolt controlled vast stretches of the French countryside, with some rebel bands even forging temporary alliances with sympathetic townspeople. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed possible that the entire feudal order might collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. But the nobles, though initially stunned, reacted with calculated brutality. A coalition of knights led by Charles the Bad of Navarre, a man who knew his own privileges were at stake, crushed the rebellion in a series of massacres. Captured rebels were hanged without trial, burned alive, or torn apart by horses as a warning. The retribution was so extreme that even chroniclers of the time, no friends of peasants, wrote of its savagery with unease. Yet the Jacquerie's legacy outlasted the bloodshed. For generations afterward, French nobles slept less soundly, knowing how quickly privilege could become a death sentence. The revolt also exposed a bitter truth. When war and famine pushed people past desperation, not even stone walls could protect those who ruled without mercy. Though it failed, the Jacquerie became a dark legend whispered in royal courts, proof that oppression, left unchecked, could ignite fires no army could fully extinguish. Bohemia in the early 15th century was a powder keg where spiritual yearning and earthly suffering collided with explosive force. When reformer Jan Hus was burned at the stake in 1415 for challenging church corruption, he lit a fire that would rage across Central Europe for decades. But this wasn't just a religious conflict. It became a social revolution as peasants and townsfolk united under the Hussite banner, armed with radical ideas about equality and a burning desire to overturn the old order. At the heart of this movement stood Jan Zizka, a one-eyed military genius who transformed farmers and craftsmen into an unstoppable force. His secret: Innovation. While knights clung to traditional cavalry charges, Zizka's peasant armies rolled out war wagons, wooden fortresses on wheels that could be circled into instant fortifications. Picture these mobile strongholds bristling with crossbows and early handguns, turning open fields into death traps for armored nobles. Time and again, imperial forces sent by the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor marched in confidence, only to be humiliated by these makeshift armies. What made the Hussite threat so terrifying to Europe's rulers wasn't just their battlefield successes, it was their vision of a new world. Their 12 demands, proclaimed from hilltops and pulpits, mixed religious reform with social justice, communion for all believers, not just priests, an end to church wealth, fair treatment for laborers. For the first time, peasants weren't just rebelling against taxes, they were claiming spiritual and political equality. The establishment reacted with predictable horror. 5 separate crusades were launched against the Hussites, each ending in disaster. At the Battle of Sudoma in 1420, Zizka's forces, outnumbered 3-1, used the terrain itself as a weapon, flooding fields to bog down enemy knights. Their victories sent shockwaves through Christendom, proving that divine right and noble birth meant nothing against well-organized commoners fighting for something greater than themselves. Yet the movement's greatest strength, its radical ideals, also sowed the seeds of its undoing. As moderates and radicals split over how far reform should go, the unity that had defied empires began to fracture. Zizka's death in 1424 marked a turning point. Though his successors kept winning battles, the original vision faded. The eventual compromise with the church preserved some religious freedoms but left the social order largely intact. Still, the Hussite Wars left an indelible mark. They demonstrated that peasant armies could outthink and outfight feudal elites when motivated by shared belief. Their war wagons became precursors to modern artillery tactics, studied by military historians centuries later. Most importantly, they proved that when spiritual awakening and material suffering combined, even the mightiest thrones could tremble. The message echoed far beyond Bohemia. If common people could hold off all of Europe for 2 generations, what else might be possible? The German countryside trembled in 1524 as an idea spread like wildfire. What if the Bible's promise of spiritual freedom also meant liberation from chains of earthly oppression? When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, he unwittingly handed peasants a weapon sharper than any sword. Across village squares and vineyard-covered hills, laborers who'd spent lifetimes bowed under feudal burdens began asking a dangerous question. If all souls were equal before God, why should nobles live in luxury while children starved? Their answer came in the form of 12 articles, a revolutionary manifesto demanding fair rents, communal forests, and an end to serfdom. Signed by representatives from nearly 300 villages, it wasn't just a petition, it was a blueprint for a new world. At first, the rebellion burned bright with moral certainty. Peasant armies, some numbering in the tens of thousands, marched under banners embroidered with Luther's slogan, "The freedom of a Christian." They seized monasteries, burned tax records, and even established democratic councils in liberated towns. For a moment, it seemed the Reformation spirit might topple not just church corruption but the entire feudal order. Their tactics revealed surprising sophistication, organized columns with supply lines, coordinated attacks on noble strongholds, and skilled negotiators who tried to win over sympathetic city dwellers. Then came the betrayal that would drown the movement in blood. Luther, horrified at how his religious reforms had sparked social upheaval, penned a venomous pamphlet titled, "Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants." His words gave terrified nobles exactly what they needed: divine permission for slaughter, mercenary armies funded by panicked elites descended with systematic brutality. At Frankenhausen, 6,000 poorly armed peasants found themselves surrounded by artillery and cavalry. When they raised a rainbow-colored banner symbolizing God's covenant, the nobles responded with cannon fire. Those who survived the initial barrage were hunted down like animals, their bodies left hanging from trees as warnings. The aftermath revealed the revolt's tragic irony. Many rebel leaders had been devout Lutherans, convinced their struggle aligned with biblical justice. Yet without clear military strategy or unified command, their courage proved no match for professional killers. Estimates suggest over 100,000 peasants perished in the crackdown, a death toll so staggering it left entire regions depopulated. Nobleman Florian Jacquerie, one of the few aristocrats who joined the rebellion, captured the tragedy in his dying words, "We are all brothers, yet you slaughter us like sheep." What made this suppression uniquely devastating wasn't just its scale, but how thoroughly it shattered the alliance between religious and social reform. Future uprisings would learn from its failures, the need for better arms, clearer leadership, and skepticism toward intellectual allies who might retreat when revolution grew too hot. Yet the 12 articles endured, resurfacing in later democratic movements as proof that even crushed rebellions plant seeds. When a noble sneered at a captured rebel, asking if he really believed common folk could govern themselves, the peasant's reply echoed through history. Did you learn your cruelty by divine right, or simply because no one stopped you? The silence that followed spoke volumes. Florence in 1378 was supposed to be a jewel of Renaissance prosperity, unless you were one of the Ciompi, the wool workers who scrubbed and carded raw fleece until their hands bled. While merchant princes adorned palaces with gold leaf, these laborers slept in crowded slums, their wages cut whenever profits dipped. Then came the summer when patience ran out. What began as a strike over unpaid wages exploded into something unimaginable, the poorest workers seizing control of one of Europe's wealthiest cities. The Siampes rebellion was a masterclass in urban uprising. Unlike peasant revolts that marched across countryside manors, this was a battle fought in narrow alleys and guild halls. Workers stormed the Palazzo della Signoria not with pitchforks but with precise demands, representation in government, fixed wages, and the right to form their own guild. For 6 weeks, they held power electing their own officials, passing laws to protect laborers, even minting coins stamped with their emblem. Imagine the shock on elite faces when former servants sat in seats of power, debating policies that once would have earned them a whipping. Yet the revolt's brilliance also contained its fatal flaw. Rural rebellions could melt into forests when defeated, but urban rebels were trapped within city walls. The Ciampes' victory depended on fragile alliances with minor guild shopkeepers and craftsmen, who grew nervous as radical voices called for redistributing wealth. When the elite struck back, they didn't need armies, they used whispers, dividing the movement by promising concessions to some while crushing others. They isolated the Ciompi until only the most desperate remained. The final blow came not in battle, but in a quiet coup, former allies locking the workers out of government halls, as if their brief reign had been a fever dream. What lingers isn't just the failure, but the revelation. For those 6 weeks, Florence proved something terrifying to rulers everywhere, that a city's lifeblood, its laborers, could not only stop the machines of profit but command them. Though the Ciompi were eventually hunted down or driven into exile, their ghost haunted Italian politics for generations. Future uprisings studied their tactics, while merchants learned to grant just enough reforms to prevent revolution. Most importantly, the revolt exposed a truth that still echoes. When those who build the world demand to own a piece of it, even the grandest palaces have shaky foundations. Hungary in 1514 was supposed to witness a holy war, thousands of peasants answering the Pope's call to fight Ottoman invaders. Instead, it became a lesson in how desperation twists faith into fury. György Dózsa, a seasoned soldier of humble birth, found himself leading not a crusade but an uprising when nobles sabotaged their own campaign. These lords, fearing Ottoman armies more than they feared God, forced peasants to march without pay or supplies, then demanded extra taxes from families left behind. The final insult came when church bells rang not for battle, but to summon laborers back to noble fields. That's when Dózsa's war cry changed. If we cannot fight Turks, we will fight the wolves devouring Hungary from within. What followed was one of Eastern Europe's most organized revolts. Peasant armies, hardened by years of border skirmishes, employed tactics that stunned their aristocratic enemies. They captured entire counties, burning debt records and declaring an end to feudal obligations. In Transylvania, rebels turned a noble's castle into their capital, issuing proclamations that echoed Hussite ideals. No man shall call another master, for Christ made all equal. For months, it seemed the rebellion might forge a new Hungary from the ashes of the old order, yet the nobility's revenge would be etched in nightmares. After trapping Dózsa's forces at Temesvar, victorious lords devised a punishment so grotesque it became legend. They forced the rebel leader to sit on a red-hot iron throne, crowned with glowing metal, while starving comrades were made to eat his flesh. This wasn't just execution, it was theater, designed to sear the lesson into peasant minds for generations. Over 6,000 rebels were impaled along roadsides, their corpses left to rot as warnings. The rebellion's legacy lies in its contradictions. It began with pious intent yet birthed radical egalitarianism. It failed militarily but succeeded in exposing nobility's fragile authority. Most importantly, it proved that crusading zeal, once redirected against domestic oppressors, could shake thrones more violently than any foreign army. When a surviving rebel was asked why they dared challenge knights in armor, his answer haunted Hungary's elite: because chains weigh heavier than steel. Beneath the shadow of Frankish swords, the Saxon peasants did something extraordinary. They reached back to the gods their ancestors had worshipped before Charlemagne's forced conversions. The year was 841, and the Stellinger Uprising wasn't just a fight against taxes or labor demands, it was a cultural reckoning. These farmers and herders, oppressed by Frankish nobles and clergy, didn't merely want better conditions. They wanted to tear out the roots of foreign rule that had choked their traditions for generations. Their battle cry, a return to the old laws, the pre-Christian customs that had once governed their lands. What made the Stellinger movement so radical was its deliberate revival of pagan identity. As Frankish empires fractured after Louis the Pious's death, Saxon rebels saw their chance. They burned churches not just as symbols of oppression, but as acts of spiritual defiance. Local leaders, once suppressed by Christian authorities, re-emerged to organize communities under ancient tribal councils. For 2 turbulent years, entire regions slipped from Frankish control as peasants reinstated traditional justice systems, settling disputes under oak trees rather than in clerical courts. Yet this revolt remains curiously absent from many history books, and the reasons reveal uncomfortable truths. Medieval chroniclers, nearly all church-affiliated, dismissed the Stellinger as devil-worshipping savages. Even modern scholars sometimes overlook it, framing medieval conflicts as purely economic rather than cultural. But the rebellion's brilliance lay in how it intertwined both. The Saxons understood that Frankish rule wasn't just about taking their grain, it was about erasing who they were. When they destroyed tithe records, they weren't just rejecting taxes, they were refusing the very system that made them foreigners in their own land. The Frankish response was predictably brutal. Nobles who'd been warring amongst themselves temporarily united to crush the rebellion, slaughtering leaders and reinstituting Christian law with renewed harshness. But the Stellingers' legacy endured in whispers. Their defiance became a blueprint for later revolts where cultural identity fueled resistance from the Baltic pagans holding out against Teutonic knights to Celtic communities preserving language under Norman boots. Most importantly, the uprising exposed a truth rulers would later grapple with, that people pushed too far don't just demand bread, they reclaim their souls. As one Frankish chronicler grudgingly admitted, they fought not as desperate men, but as men remembering what it was to be free. That memory proved harder to kill than any rebel. The vineyards of Catalonia should have been peaceful in 1640, ripe with grapes and olive groves untouched by war. But when Madrid demanded more soldiers and silver to fuel Spain's endless European conflicts, something snapped. Farmers who'd spent generations working the same terraced hills found themselves drafted into foreign wars while tax collectors stripped their pantries bare. What began as a refusal to house royal troops in peasant homes escalated into something far greater, a revolution that would blur the line between class revolt and national independence. Unlike earlier uprisings, the Catalan rebellion had a secret weapon unity across social lines. Wealthy Barcelona merchants, furious over lost trade privileges, made common cause with mountain villagers who simply wanted to keep their bread. Together, they turned local grievances into a political earthquake. The spark came on Corpus Christi Day, when reapers, seasonal laborers already pushed to the brink joined city crowds in storming the viceroy's palace. By sunset, Spanish officials lay dead in the streets, and Catalonia stood at the edge of declaring itself a republic under French protection. What followed was a masterclass in how peasant pragmatism could shape high politics. Rebel leaders like Josep Margarit, a minor noble turned guerrilla commander, proved shockingly adept at turning farmland into fortresses. Catalan peasants, knowing every goat path and irrigation channel, ambushed royal armies in terrain where heavy cavalry became useless. Meanwhile, village councils took over tax collection, not to abolish it but to fund their own defense. This wasn't chaos, it was state building from the soil up. For 19 turbulent years, Catalonia functioned as a de facto independent nation. Its peasant militias held key mountain passes against Spanish forces 3 times their size. Barcelona's elites, initially hesitant, soon found themselves relying on rural leaders who'd organized supply networks stretching from Pyrenees monasteries to coastal fishing villages. At its height, the rebellion even minted coins bearing the slogan, "The Free Land of Catalonia," a direct challenge to the idea that kingdoms could only be ruled by divine right monarchs. Yet the revolt's greatest strength, its reliance on peasant endurance, also spelled its doom. As French allies grew distracted by other wars, Catalan villagers faced starvation from blockaded harvests. The final betrayal came not on the battlefield, but in a secret treaty where France traded Catalan autonomy for Spanish concessions elsewhere. When Spanish troops finally re-entered Barcelona in 1659, they found a people too exhausted to resist, but not too broken to remember. The rebellion's legacy lingers in modern Catalonia's independence movement, but its real lesson is broader. Here was a revolt where peasants didn't just demand bread, they drafted constitutions. Where field hands became diplomats negotiating with European powers. Most importantly, it proved that when local loyalty runs deeper than royal decrees, even the mightiest empires can fracture at the seams. As one Spanish general lamented in his memoirs, "We won the castles, but the hills never surrendered." Switzerland in 1653 presented a paradox, a land famed for alpine freedom, where villagers still bent under the weight of urban bankers. The war that erupted wasn't against kings or foreign invaders, but against the very republic these peasants had helped build. When Lucian's magistrates demanded emergency taxes to pay mercenaries an endless drain on rural communities, something in the mountain air shifted. Farmers who'd once carried pikes to defend Swiss independence now turned them against Zurich and Bern's patrician elite, their battle cry cutting to the heart of the hypocrisy. We are the true Confederates. This wasn't just another tax revolt. The Swiss peasants drafted a constitution, the Mühlhausen Articles, demanding direct democracy for rural cantons and an end to debt slavery. Their organization stunned contemporaries. Village delegates coordinated across valleys using church bells and coded messages, while blacksmiths forged not just weapons but seals for their alternative government. At its height, the rebellion fielded 15,000 disciplined troops, some veterans of Europe's wars, who employed terrain with lethal precision. In the Intelbuch Valley, they ambushed professional soldiers by rolling boulders down slopes their grandfathers had terraced. What made this uprising unique was its target. Unlike revolts against monarchies, here peasants challenged a republic that mythologized its own egalitarianism. The urban elite's panic revealed their unspoken truth: Swiss liberty had always been selective. Bern's response was a masterclass in betrayal. After pretending to negotiate, they hired Catholic and Protestant mercenaries alike, uniting old religious enemies under one banner: property rights. The final battle at Wohlenschwil lasted less than an hour, artillery smashing peasant columns while cavalry chased survivors into the Ahr River. Yet the war's aftermath proved more revealing than its violence. Instead of mass executions, the victors imposed something subtler: systemic erasure. Rebel leaders weren't just killed but publicly dismembered, their body parts displayed in different villages to sever symbolic unity. Urban chroniclers rewrote the conflict as a brief disturbance rather than a civil war. Most insidiously, the elites co-opted the rebellion's language, issuing pardons that framed peasant demands as gifts from above, not inherent rights. The rebellion's ghost lingers in Switzerland's slow embrace of true democracy. It took 2 more centuries for rural cantons to gain equal representation, and the debt reforms rebels demanded only came after Napoleon's invasion. But the deeper lesson resonates far beyond the Alps, that systems calling themselves free often guard inequality most fiercely. When a captured peasant was asked why he'd risk everything against a republic, his reply still chills: because tyranny wears many coats, and today it's stitched with the thread of our own flags. In the rugged hills of Languedoc, where the 100 Years' War had turned fertile valleys into battlegrounds, a different kind of resistance took root, one that fought not for crowns but for survival. The Tuchens, named after the Occitan word for hedgehog, became France's shadow army, a network of peasants, shepherds, and outlaws who waged a silent war against all who trampled their fields. While kings and nobles clashed in glittering armor, these rebels struck from the mist, vanishing into forests they knew like the lines on their hands. Their weapons weren't lances or siege engines, but stolen knives, poisoned wells, and an intimate knowledge of every goat path between villages. What made the Tuchen revolt extraordinary wasn't its scale, it was its invisibility. Unlike dramatic peasant marches on castles, this was a conflict of ambushes and sabotage. Tax collectors disappeared on lonely roads. Noble hunting parties returned short a few men. Storage barns earmarked for war provisions burned mysteriously after harvests. For over 20 years, from 1363 to 1384, the Tuchens turned occupied territories into nightmares for both English garrisons and French aristocracy alike. Their genius lay in asymmetry. Why face armored knights when you could starve them instead? The movement's structure revealed a chilling sophistication. Cells operated in isolation, communicating through coded messages woven into folk songs or market chatter. A blacksmith might shoe a horse with weakened nails, ensuring a noble's mount would collapse mid-chase. A tavern keeper could spike wine with laxatives before a troop's march. Every act was deniable, every participant just another face in the crowd. When authorities cracked down, they found no leaders to hang, only the sullen silence of entire villages. Yet the Tuchens' greatest weapon was their dual betrayal. They refused to pick sides in a war that had bled them dry. French chroniclers dismissed them as bandits, while English commanders cursed them as ghosts. In truth, they were pragmatists. When a French lord demanded grain, they smuggled it to English-held towns for silver. When English soldiers seized their livestock, they redirected the theft to rival French nobles' lands. This wasn't chaos, it was a calculated strategy to turn oppressors against each other. The revolt's end came not through defeat, but dissolution. As the 100 Years' War sputtered toward truces, the Tuchens melted back into the landscape, their names forgotten by history books that favor clear battles over shadow wars. But their legacy lingers in the unanswerable question they posed. How many other rebellions flickered in the margins of chronicles, erased because they left no castles to storm or kings to negotiate? The Tuchens remind us that sometimes the most dangerous revolutions aren't those that roar, but those that whisper. Galicia's mist-shrouded hills hid a secret in the 15th century. Peasants weren't just farming the land, they were studying castle walls. While other rebellions crumbled before stone fortresses, the Irmandiños did something revolutionary. They turned feudal symbols into rubble. Between 1467 and 1469, this brotherhood of farmers, craftsmen, and even low-ranking clergy demolished over 100 noble strongholds across northwest Spain. But this wasn't mindless destruction, it was surgical. Their targets were carefully chosen. Towers where lords tortured tenants, dungeons where harvests were extorted, and armories stocked with weapons meant to keep them obedient. What set the Irmandiños apart wasn't just their ambition, but their preparation. For years, they'd organized in plain sight under the guise of religious guilds, the hermandades that gave them their name. While nobles dismissed these groups as harmless prayer circles, they were actually training grounds. Blacksmiths honed skills not just for plows but for siege tools. Village priests, tired of watching parishioners starve, copied castle blueprints from confessionals where guards gossiped. When the time came, their attacks were methodical, surrounding multiple fortresses simultaneously so nobles couldn't reinforce each other, using farming equipment to scale walls and repurposing millstones as battering rams. The revolt's temporary success reveals a fascinating tactical evolution. Unlike earlier uprisings that faltered before mounted knights, the Irmandiños exploited their enemies' arrogance. Galician nobles, convinced peasants wouldn't dare touch stone monuments to their power, had let fortresses decay into neglect, their moats clogged with weeds, their garrisons skeleton crews of bored retainers. The rebels didn't just overpower these symbols, they erased them with almost ceremonial precision. At the castle of Monterrey, witnesses described how villagers formed human chains to pass stones from the demolished walls into nearby rivers, ensuring nothing could be rebuilt. Yet the movement's most radical innovation was legal, not military. In liberated zones, Irmandiño captains established provisional courts where peasants testified against lords, flipping the feudal script by putting nobility on trial. Surviving records show astonishing detail. Rent rolls corrected to fair values, stolen livestock returned, even rulings against noblemen for assaulting servant women. For 2 extraordinary years, swaths of Galicia functioned without titled rulers, proving feudal bonds weren't divine mandates but fragile human constructs. Their downfall came from an unexpected quarter, not local knights, but the crown they'd hoped would support them. When Queen Isabella learned commoners were redrawing property lines, she sent royal troops to restore order, backing nobles whose authority she needed for her own power plays. The final battle at Altamira saw farmers facing professional soldiers armed with the very weapons trade the Irmandinos had once supplied through taxes. But here's what history often misses: the rebellion's afterlife. Unlike crushed uprisings where survivors slunk back to fields, the Irmandinos negotiated terms. Many castles stayed rubble because lords lacked funds to rebuild. Peasant communities retained hard-won concessions on rents and labor dues. Most importantly, they'd exposed nobility's dirty secret, that castles weren't invincible fortresses, but stage props trembling before collective will. As one Galician proverb born from the revolt goes, a wall is only as strong as the fear it inspires. The Irmandinos proved that when that fear evaporates, even the mightiest stones can be carried away in peasant hands. Deep in Sweden's copper-rich mountains, where winter winds howled through mine shafts and frost clung to peasant cottages, a different kind of treasure fueled rebellion, not silver or ore, but the unshakable belief that those who dug the kingdom's wealth should have a say in its rule. The Deucalian rebellions weren't fleeting outbursts of anger. They were a slow-burning fuse of defiance that ignited again and again across 2 centuries, proving that even in Scandinavia's icy north, oppression could spark fires hot enough to melt royal resolve. At first glance, these uprisings seemed like simple tax revolts. Danish kings, hungry for copper profits to fund their European wars, squeezed miners with impossible quotas while granting German merchants monopolies on trade. But beneath the surface, something far more potent was stirring, a fusion of class rage and budding Swedish nationalism, the miners' battle cry, Vi är svenskar. "Oh, we are Swedes," wasn't just about language. It was a direct challenge to foreign rule that treated them as expendable labor. Unlike other peasant revolts that targeted local lords, the Deucalians took aim at the crown itself, their grievances etched not just in ledgers but in songs passed down through generations. What made these rebels extraordinary was their endurance. While most uprisings flared and faded within months, the Deucalians kept returning like the stubborn winters of their homeland. In 1521, they joined Gustav Vasa's war for independence against Denmark, only to turn on him when his new monarchy proved just as extractive. Their weapons were as ingenious as their resolve: improvised cannons forged from mining equipment, tunnels repurposed as guerrilla hideouts, even using copper shipments to smuggle messages between villages. When royal troops marched into the region, they found not chaotic mobs but disciplined units organized by mine captains who'd learned strategy from tunneling through rock. The rebellion's high point came in 1532, when thousands of miners and peasants besieged Stockholm itself. For weeks, the capital trembled as rebels dug earthworks modeled after mine fortifications, their knowledge of explosives turning city gates into splinters. King Gustav, who'd once relied on their support, now faced an existential threat from the very people who'd helped him seize power. His panicked letters to German mercenaries reveal the shock. These are not common rabble, but men who fight as if hell's furnace burns in their hearts. Yet the Deucalian story isn't one of clear victory or defeat. Through negotiated truces and temporary concessions, the rebellions flickered on, flaring up again in 1573, when miners burned tax records in the Great Copper Mountain Revolt, then smoldering into the 17th century with smaller strikes against timber monopolies. Each time they were suppressed but never fully extinguished, their legacy lingers in Sweden's unusually strong tradition of local governance, where even today, remote mining towns retain a fierce independence unseen in other European regions. The true measure of their impact lies in what they forced kings to acknowledge: that a nation built on its people's labor couldn't indefinitely ignore those people's voices. When a Danish envoy scoffed at rebel demands, asking how illiterate miners dared dictate terms to royalty, a gray-bearded miner reportedly replied, "The ore knows no crown, it answers only to those who dig." In those words lay a truth that echoed far beyond Scandinavia's forests, that loyalty, like copper, could be mined only so deep before the vein ran dry. Long before German peasants marched under Luther's banner, their rebellion was being whispered into existence in wine cellars and mill houses across the Black Forest. The Bundscha movement, named for the tied peasant shoe that became their secret emblem, wasn't just a precursor to the Great Uprising of 1524. It was a masterclass in how oppression breeds patience. For 30 years, these underground networks wove dissent through the fabric of village life, proving that revolutions aren't always born in explosive moments. Sometimes they're painstakingly stitched together, one whispered oath at a time. What made the Bundscha so dangerous to nobles wasn't their weapons, crudely forged scythes and hunting knives, but their organizational genius. They operated in decentralized cells, each unaware of the other's members, communicating through symbols chalked on barn doors or hymns with double meanings sung at harvest festivals. A loaf left on a windowsill might signal a midnight meeting. A particular knot tied in a shoelace could identify allies at market. Their demands, carefully copied and hidden in Bible cavities, went far beyond lower taxes. They envisioned a world without serfdom, where forests and rivers belonged to communities rather than lords, a radical democracy centuries ahead of its time. The movement's most brilliant tactic was its use of the very systems meant to control peasants. Church confessionals became recruiting grounds, with sympathetic priests identifying potential rebels through veiled conversations. Millers, whose grinding wheels provided cover for private talks, acted as intelligence hubs. Even noble estates were infiltrated. Kitchen servants relayed troop movements hidden in bread deliveries, while stable boys loosened saddle girths before crucial pursuits. This wasn't chaos, it was asymmetric warfare waged with the tools of everyday life. Yet the Bundscha's greatest strength, secrecy, also led to its most heartbreaking failures. In 1513, a planned uprising near Freiburg collapsed when a drunk miller bragged about the plot to the wrong traveler. Captured rebels faced gruesome executions. Leaders were broken on wheels, their bodies displayed in iron cages as warnings. But here's what authorities didn't understand. Each martyr's death didn't extinguish the movement. It became fuel. The Bundscha's symbols spread faster than torturers could work, their iconic shoe painted on walls from Alsace to Thuringia. When the full Peasants' War erupted a decade later, veterans of these failed revolts became its most skilled tacticians. What lingers isn't just their methods, but their moral clarity. Unlike later rebellions that sought compromise, the Bundscha's manifestos, preserved in a handful of daring manuscripts, spoke in startlingly modern terms about human dignity. No man is born with a saddle on his back. Read one leaflet nailed to a church door in 1500, nor another booted and spurred to ride him. This wasn't just economic grievance, it was a philosophical challenge to feudalism's very foundations. When a captured Bundscha leader was asked why he'd risk everything, his reply cut through centuries: "Because my children count the stars through the holes in our roof, while my lord's dogs sleep on velvet." The silence that followed his hanging spoke louder than any sermon. The autumn of 1536 found England's north seething with a dangerous paradox: 40,000 men marching under banners of the Virgin Mary, armed with farming tools and righteous fury, yet calling themselves not rebels but pilgrims. The Pilgrimage of Grace looked like a holy protest against Henry VIII's break with Rome, but peel back the velvet crosses stitched to their tunics. and you'd find grievances far earthier than theological debate. When the king dissolved monasteries, he didn't just strip altars of gold, he ripped apart a centuries-old safety net. Those cloisters had been hospitals for the sick, almshouses for the poor, and employers for entire villages. Now, with monastic lands auctioned to the highest bidder, peasants faced a brutal new world where even the dead weren't safe graves dug up for lead coffins to melt into royal coffers. What made this uprising extraordinary was its unlikely leadership. At its head stood Robert Aske, a one-eyed lawyer who spun legal arguments into rallying cries, framing resistance as loyalty to the true faith and ancient rites. His genius lay in unifying divergent forces, gentry fearing lost influence, farmers enraged by enclosure laws, and devout Catholics mourning stolen relics. Their oath, sworn on village Bibles across Yorkshire, bound them together, not to overthrow the crown, but to preserve the church and commonwealth. This careful phrasing gave cover to nobles who might balk at outright rebellion, while giving peasants moral authority to demand fixed rents and restored feast days. For months, the North became a shadow kingdom, with Aske's pilgrims administering oaths of allegiance to their cause in cathedral squares. Henry's initial panic reveals how close the revolt came to altering history. With most royal troops tied up suppressing smaller rebellions, the road to London lay startlingly open. Had the pilgrims marched south instead of negotiating at Doncaster Bridge, they might have found the capital ripe for taking, its citizens simmering with their own grievances over food shortages and religious turmoil. But Aske, ever the lawyer, trusted in the king's promise of pardon and parliament. It was a fatal miscalculation. Once Henry regrouped, his vengeance was methodical. Noble supporters were coaxed into betraying the movement with promises of clemency. Aske himself was lured to London under false pretenses, then hanged in chains from York's city walls, his body left to rot where pilgrims had once cheered his speeches. The rebellion's collapse marked more than just another failed revolt. It signaled the end of an era. Henry's response was a blueprint for modern statecraft. Divide opponents with selective pardons, dismantle regional power bases, and flood rebellious areas with propaganda portraying resistance as treason. Within months, new royal castles rose in the north, not to defend against Scots but to intimidate his own subjects. The monasteries stayed closed, their lands financing a standing army that made future uprisings nearly impossible. Most crucially, the pilgrimage proved that religious fervor and economic justice, when yoked together, could mobilize forces even kings feared. A lesson Elizabeth I would remember when facing her own northern rebellions decades later. What lingers isn't just the tragedy of misplaced trust, but the tantalizing what-ifs. Had the pilgrims pressed their advantage, might England have remained Catholic? Would peasant rights have found a voice in Tudor policy? The answers died with Aske on that York scaffold, but the questions still whisper through history. As one disillusioned rebel muttered before his execution, "We sought only to mend what was broken, yet found that kings prefer shattered men to mended altars." In those words lay a truth Henry himself came to dread, that even the mightiest throne rests on the patience of those who kneel before it. The forests of northern Croatia whispered with conspiracy in the winter of 1573, as peasants passed secret messages hidden in loaves of black bread. At the heart of this underground network stood Matija Gubek, a pig farmer whose quiet charisma turned village grievances into a revolutionary force. Unlike other rebellions that erupted spontaneously, this was a carefully plotted strike against Habsburg rule, a demand not just for lower taxes, but for an entirely new social order they called the Peasant Kingdom. Gubek's vision was startlingly modern. elected village judges replacing noble appointees, fair distribution of common lands, and an end to the brutal robot system that bound families to unpaid labor. When his followers swore oaths over crossed sides, they weren't just arming for battle. They were pledging allegiance to an idea that terrified empires that soil tilled by peasant hands should belong to those who worked it. The revolt's early successes revealed Gübeck's tactical brilliance. Peasant armies, organized into units mirroring Habsburg military structures, captured key fortresses not through brute force but subterfuge. Disguised as delivermen, rebels smuggled weapons in grain carts past sleeping guards. A miller's daughter, pretending to bring laundry to garrisons, memorized patrol routes. By the time nobles realized their castles were under siege, entire regions had already fallen to what chroniclers dismissively called the Barefoot Kingdom. At Stubich topless, Gübeck staged a symbolic coronation, not with a golden crown, but a wreath of oak leaves, declaring that true strength grew from the land itself. Yet the Habsburg response would etch this rebellion into Balkan legend. Imperial forces, initially caught off guard, regrouped with mercenary cavalry and German artillery. The decisive battle at Stubiczko Polj saw peasants outnumbered 5-1, their scythes no match for cannon fire. Survivors later described Gübeck fighting atop a wagon until his weapons shattered, then hurling rocks until captured. What followed wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare. The Habsburgs staged Gübeck's death as a grotesque parody of peasant aspirations, crowned with a red-hot iron circlet, dragged through streets on a wooden plow, and finally quartered alive before thousands of forcibly assembled villagers. But here's what the empire underestimated: the power of martyrdom. Gübeck's crucifixion didn't erase his ideals, it immortalized them. Folk songs comparing him to Christ spread through mountain valleys, turning suppressed rebellion into cultural memory. 19th century nationalists would resurrect his image during anti-Habsburg uprisings, while Yugoslav communists later recast him as a proto-socialist hero. Even today, Croatian schoolchildren learn his last words not from history books but from oral ballads. "You can burn my body, but the seeds are already scattered." The revolt's enduring resonance lies in its contradictions. A leader who sought practical reforms became a mythical figure. A military failure birthed an unkillable symbol. Most importantly, Gübeck's story exposes the paradox of peasant revolts, that crushing the body of a movement often gives wings to its soul. As one Habsburg commander grumbled in a private letter years later, "We killed the man too thoroughly and made the legend immortal." In the end, the Iron Crown, meant to mock his ambitions, only sealed his place in history, a ruler not of land but of memory. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of Versailles, French kings clung to a curious obsession, controlling every grain of salt in their realm. The gabelle, an ancient salt tax turned royal monopoly, wasn't just about revenue. It was a daily humiliation for peasants who needed salt to preserve food, cure leather, and feed livestock. Unlike dramatic bread riots or fiery revolts, resistance to the gabelle took subtler forms: smugglers wading through moonlit marshes with contraband sacks, village women hiding salt in false-bottomed milk pails, even priests blessing clandestine shipments from their altars. These weren't random acts of defiance, but a quiet war against a system where royal inspectors could demand to inspect a family's stew pot to ensure they weren't using untaxed salt. What made these rebellions extraordinary was their persistence. For over 400 years, from the 14th century to the Revolution, the gabelle sparked uprisings that flickered like stubborn embers across France. In Gascony, armed salt smugglers known as faux sauniers organized nighttime raids on tax warehouses, their faces blackened with charcoal to avoid recognition. Brittany, exempt from the tax due to ancient privileges, became a smuggling hub where entire coastal villages built secret compartments into fishing boats. The punishments for getting caught were brutal branding with hot irons, galley slavery, even hanging, yet the flow of untaxed salt never stopped. The tax's absurd complexity fueled the rage. Salt prices varied wildly between regions, creating a patchwork where crossing a river could multiply the cost tenfold. Royal officials imposed mandatory purchases, forcing families to buy set quantities of overpriced salt whether they needed it or not. In the 17th century, a peasant in Anjou might pay 30 times what a Parisian did for the same scoop from the royal salt barns. This wasn't just economic exploitation. It was psychological warfare, a constant reminder that the crown could reach into every kitchen and workshop. When explosive revolts did erupt, they revealed the Gabel's hidden power as a revolutionary spark. In 1643, the New Pieds Rebellion saw Normandy's salt workers, many literally barefoot from poverty, march under banners reading "Death to the Gabel." They burned tax offices and lynched collectors until Cardinal Richelieu sent troops to drown the revolt in blood. A century later, similar fury gripped Bordeaux when officials tried extending the tax to previously exempt regions. Artisans and vineyard workers united with peasants, storming the city's salt stores and tossing taxed crystals into the Garonne River until the water turned white. Historians often overlook how these scattered uprisings laid kindling for the French Revolution. The cahiers de doléances, those lists of grievances drafted before 1789, overflowed with salt tax complaints from every province. When Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille, they also raided the massive saltpeter stores that symbolized royal monopoly. The Gabel's true legacy wasn't just in coins extracted, but in the lesson it taught generations of French commoners that oppression wears many disguises, sometimes as plain as a spoonful of salt. As one smuggler carved into his prison cell before execution, "They tax our sweat, then demand we pay for the salt to wipe our brows." That bitter truth, repeated in 1,000 market squares, made the Gabel more than a tax. It became a rehearsal for revolution. The fields of Bulgaria ran red in the summer of 1277, not with the blood of peasants, but with the spilled arrogance of Mongol warlords and boyar nobles who'd ruled with unchecked cruelty. At the center of this storm stood a man history remembers by two names: Ivaylo the Cabbage, the derisive nickname given by nobles who sneered at his swineherd origins, and Tsar Ivaylo, the title he would wrench from their grasp through sheer military genius. His story begins not in a palace, but in the mud-stained boots of a man who knew hunger firsthand. A shepherd who'd watched Mongol raiders burn his village one too many times, who'd seen boyars feast while children starved, and who decided the only difference between a throne and a dung heap was who got to sit on it. What made Ivaylo's revolt extraordinary wasn't just his victories, it was their scale and speed. With a ragtag army of peasants armed with little more than axes and righteous fury, he first annihilated a Mongol force at Divina Pass using terrain as his ally, funneling cavalry into marshes where their horses floundered. Within months, his fame spread like wildfire, drawing deserters from noble armies and even lesser boyars disillusioned with the weak Tsar Constantine. By winter, he'd defeated not only the Mongols but the royal army sent to crush him, forcing the nobility to do the unthinkable: invite a swineherd to marry the widowed Tsarina and rule alongside her. For one dizzying year, the man who'd once guarded pigs wore the Bulgarian crown. Ivaylo's brief reign revealed a ruler far more nuanced than his enemies claimed. He didn't just redistribute lands to peasants, he reformed taxes to punish hoarding boyars, reorganized the army to reward merit over birth, and even negotiated with Byzantium as an equal. His court became a spectacle, nobles forced to kneel before a man who'd once been legally forbidden to look them in the eye. But his greatest triumph came when the Mongols returned, expecting easy prey. Ivaylo led from the front, smashing their forces at Silistra in 1279, a victory so complete that chroniclers claim the Khan's surviving generals fled at the mere rumor of his approach. Yet the very forces that lifted Ivaylo doomed him. The boyars, humiliated by his reforms, conspired with Byzantium to replace him with a more pliable aristocrat. Betrayed at the gates of Drastar in 1280, he fought his way free only to seek refuge with the same Mongols he'd once defeated, a twist that ended as tragically as you'd expect. The Nogai Khan, after initially welcoming him, had Ivaylo assassinated during a feast, his head sent to Constantinople as a diplomatic trophy. But here's what the history books often miss: Ivaylo's ghost haunted Bulgaria for generations. Future Tsars, fearing another peasant Tsar, quietly improved conditions for farmers. The rebellion proved that feudal hierarchies weren't just unfair, they were fragile. As one noble lamented in a private letter after Ivaylo's death, "We killed the man, but the idea that a swineherd could rule better than us, that poison lingers." And in remote Bulgarian villages, folk songs still tell of the cabbage king who proved thrones grow from the same soil as turnips, if you're brave enough to plant the seeds. China in the mid-14th century was a pressure cooker of suffering, swollen rivers drowning harvests, Mongol overlords bleeding the land dry with taxes, and rumors of plague creeping along the Silk Road. Into this tinderbox stepped a sect of Buddhist rebels wearing crimson headbands, their teachings as fiery as their attire. The world was ending, the Buddha of light would descend, and only those who rose up would be spared. What began as scattered peasant uprisings under the Red Turban banner soon became history's most successful peasant revolt, one that wouldn't just topple a dynasty but birth a new golden age. The secret to their success lay in a fusion no ruler could counter: religious fervor and razor-sharp logistics. While other rebellions relied on brute force, the Red Turbans built parallel governments in liberated zones, complete with tax collectors, grain warehouses, and even schools where children learned rebel songs instead of Confucian classics. Their leaders, often former monks or disgraced officials, understood something crucial. To beat the Mongols' cavalry, they needed more than passion, they needed systems. Peasant armies drilled with stolen weapons by day, then gathered under moonlit banners to chant prophecies of the coming paradise. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a total reimagining of society where the lowest could become the elect. Key to their momentum was the movement's adaptability. In the north, rebels emphasized millenarian visions, promising the end of time would wash away Mongol sins. In the fertile Yangtze Delta, they focused on practical grievances: corrupt tax assessors who measured fields with shortened ropes, Mongol officers claiming droit du seigneur over hand brides. By the time the Yuan dynasty realized this wasn't another localized riot, entire provinces had quietly switched allegiance. City gates were opened not by siege engines, but by sympathetic laborers who'd spent months smuggling blades inside bundles of firewood. The rebellion's climax at the Battle of Lake Poyang in 1363 showcased peasant ingenuity at its finest. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former beggar turned Red Turban commander, lured the Yuan fleet into shallow waters using decoy fires, then unleashed improvised gunpowder barges floating bombs timed to explode as tides carried them into enemy lines. When the smoke cleared, the last Mongol counteroffensive lay in ruins. 3 years later, Zhu would declare himself Hongwu Emperor, founding the Ming dynasty on the bones of his own rebel past. Yet the rebellion's true legacy wasn't just a change of rulers, it was the paradox it exposed. Zhu, once a champion of peasant rights, became increasingly authoritarian, fearing the same forces that birthed his rise. The Ming's famous agrarian reforms, land redistribution, lowered taxes were as much about preventing another Red Turban uprising as they were about justice. Even the movement's religious roots were sanitized. Official histories downplayed millenarian zeal, reframing the revolt as a patriotic restoration of Han rule. What makes the Red Turbans timeless is their demonstration of revolution's double edge. They proved peasants could not only destroy empires but build them, yet also how easily the oppressed can become oppressors. As one Ming official later confessed in his memoirs, "We wore the red bands to break chains, then forged new ones from their remnants. That uneasy truth lingers wherever inequality festers, that the fire which burns down palaces can also cast long shadows." The forests of medieval Estonia held more than just pine and peat. They cradled a simmering fury that would explode on St. George's Night in 1343. After centuries under the boot of Danish kings and German crusaders, Estonian peasants didn't just rebel. They waged a war of survival against an entire colonial system designed to erase them. What began as a tax protest in Harjumaa province spiraled into a coordinated uprising across the Baltic coast, revealing how oppression could forge fighters as relentless as the northern winters. Unlike Western European revolts that often targeted local lords, this was a clash of civilizations. German chroniclers dismissed Estonians as pagan savages, but their tactics were anything but primitive. Using the dense woodlands as natural fortresses, rebel bands ambushed Teutonic knights with stolen crossbows and poisoned arrows. Villagers who'd spent generations serving as guides for foreign hunters now led those same foreigners into deadly bogs. The uprising's symbolic heart was the storming of Padai's monastery, not just a religious site, but the economic engine of German dominance, where Estonian serfs had been forced to tithe their meager harvests. When rebels torched its ledger books, they weren't merely destroying records, they were erasing the very proof of their bondage. For 18 blood-soaked months, the impossible seemed within reach. Peasant armies captured key strongholds like Tallinn's Toompea Hill, declaring an independent Estonian state under their elected king. Their demands went beyond lower taxes. They wanted German settlers expelled, native languages restored in courts, and an end to laws forbidding Estonians from bearing arms. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a blueprint for decolonization 6 centuries ahead of its time. Yet the rebellion's suppression was as brutal as its rise. Danish and Teutonic forces, momentarily divided by their own rivalries, reunited under the banner of racial superiority. Their retribution weaponized the landscape itself. Forests where rebels hid were set ablaze. Villages were razed with no distinction between fighters and families, and captured leaders were broken on wheels designed to prolong agony. The final massacre at Sov Peninsula saw thousands of Estonians driven into the sea, their bodies washing ashore for weeks as a grim lesson. What makes this uprising tragically unique is its afterlife in historical memory. While English and French peasants' revolts entered mainstream history, the St. George's Night uprising was buried under layers of foreign propaganda. German chroniclers framed it as a pagan resurgence rather than a nationalist awakening. Later Danish rulers scrubbed records to portray their rule as benevolent. Even today, many histories of medieval Europe barely mention it, a silencing that echoes the colonial erasure the rebels fought against. Yet in Estonia's folk songs and oral traditions, the rebellion never died. 19th century nationalists resurrected its symbols during their own independence struggle. When Soviet tanks rolled into Tallinn in 1944, partisans painted St. George's Cross on ruins as silent defiance. The uprising's true legacy lies in its revelation that some fires, no matter how violently stamped out, leave embers no winter can extinguish. As one surviving rebel carved into a church wall before execution, they took our land, our gods, even our names, but never our memory of freedom. That memory, passed through generations in whispers, would one day help birth a nation. The Taborites didn't just rebel against the church, they sought to unmake the medieval world itself. Named after their fortress city of Tabor, these radical Hussites took Jan Hus's calls for reform and set them ablaze with a vision so revolutionary it still echoes today. Imagine an army of farmers and craftsmen not just demanding lower taxes, but proclaiming all property communal, all titles meaningless, and Christ's return imminent. Their battle hymns weren't just prayers, they were promises of a coming apocalypse where the last would be first, and the mighty would be cast down like rotten fruit from a tree. What set the Taborites apart wasn't just their theology, it was their terrifying efficiency. While nobles scoffed at peasant soldiers, these rebels pioneered tactics that would shape warfare for centuries. Their war wagons weren't just mobile fortresses, they were early tanks circled into formations that could withstand cavalry charges while gunners fired through loopholes. Priests doubled as battlefield medics, carrying not just Bibles but surgical tools looted from monasteries. Even their artillery was revolutionary blacksmiths, reforged church bells into cannons, turning symbols of oppression into weapons of liberation. At the Battle of Sudoma, they turned a frozen fish pond into a killing field, luring armored knights onto ice that cracked beneath their weight. The movement's radical core lay in its social experiments. In Tabor's streets, coins were outlawed as relics of greed. Storehouses held food and tools for communal use, with elected overseers ensuring fair distribution. Marriages required no priest, only mutual consent, a scandal in an era where the church controlled even love. Their theologians preached that heaven wasn't just a reward after death, but something to build on earth. One surviving sermon fragment reads, "If God is father to all, then why do some children sleep on silk while others shiver in barns?" This wasn't just reform, it was a wholesale rejection of feudalism's divine justification. Yet the Taborites' greatest strength, their uncompromising zeal, also doomed them. Moderate Hussites, initially allied against Catholic crusades, grew horrified as radical preachers called for the abolition of all hierarchy. When Taborite armies began seizing lands beyond Bohemia, even sympathetic nobles balked. The final betrayal came at Lipany in 1434, where former Hussite allies turned their own wagon tactics against them. The battle's climax was pure irony. Rebel wagons, symbols of defiance, became death traps as rival forces set them ablaze with flaming arrows. But here's what history often misses: the Taborites' ideas couldn't be killed. Their communal practices inspired Anabaptist radicals during the German Peasants' War. Czech nationalists revived their symbols in the 19th century. Even Marxists would later claim them as proto-socialists, though the Taborites sought Christ's kingdom, not the workers' state. Their true legacy lies in the question they forced Europe to confront. If divine law truly favored the poor, how long could earthly kings justify their wealth? As one captured Taborite told his executioners, "You break our bodies like bread, but who will starve when the feast is meant for all?" That unsettling thought lingered long after the last wagon burned. While most of medieval Europe bowed under the weight of feudal chains, the wind-swept marshes of Frisia whispered a different story, one where peasants didn't just rebel against lords, but built a society without them entirely. Nestled along the North Sea coast, these communities of dairy farmers and fishermen crafted something extraordinary, a functioning democracy centuries before the word existed. No castles loomed over their flat horizons, no knights demanded their harvests, and when kings sent tax collectors, they were often met with a unified refusal so stubborn it became legendary. This wasn't just resistance, it was a quiet revolution that proved feudalism wasn't inevitable. The Frisian miracle began with geography as much as grit. Their soggy homeland, crisscrossed by tidal creeks and peat bogs, made cavalry charges impossible and castle building impractical. But what truly set them apart was their legal code, the Lex Frisianum, a set of laws so fiercely protective of common rights that even kings hesitated to violate them. Every spring, freeholders gathered at the Upstalsboom, an ancient oak tree, to settle disputes and elect judges without noble interference. Their assemblies functioned like miniature parliaments, where a farmer's vote carried the same weight as a wealthy merchant's. In a world where most peasants couldn't testify against lords in court, Frisians tried nobles for murder and sometimes won. Their secret weapon wasn't weapons at all, but water. The Frisians mastered hydraulic engineering, building Turban, artificial mounds to protect villages from floods, and maintaining complex dike systems. This collective labor forged a culture of mutual aid. When a storm threatened one family's land, neighbors rushed to help without waiting for a lord's command. These dike councils became the backbone of their society, proving that peasants could govern infrastructure, and by extension, themselves better than any absentee noble. Even the church struggled to penetrate their independence. Frisian priests were often locals elected by their congregations, not papal appointees. When feudal powers did try to crack Frisia's freedom, the results were disastrous. In 1297, Count Floris V of Holland learned this the hard way. His knights, bogged down in the marshes, were picked off by farmers wielding pitchforks and fishing spears. The Count himself was captured and paraded through villages in a humiliating reversal of feudal pomp. Similar fates befell German princes and Danish warlords, their expensive armor rendered useless in terrain where a teenager with a sling could sink an army. Yet the Frisians' greatest legacy wasn't their battles, but their bureaucracy. Their land registers, painstakingly maintained by village scribes, proved peasants didn't need lords to track property rights. Trade agreements with the Hanseatic League were negotiated not by crowned heads, but by guilds of cheesemakers and herring fishermen. At a time when most European languages had no word for citizen, Frisian legal documents referred to even the lowliest farmer as a free man. This experiment endured for over 500 years, longer than most dynasties, until finally succumbing not to military defeat, but to the slow creep of centralization. By the 16th century, Habsburg emperors and Dutch stadtholders gradually eroded their freedoms under the guise of modernization. But the Frisian model left an indelible mark, inspiring later republics from the Swiss cantons to America's founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson reportedly kept a copy of Frisian laws in his library, scribbling in the margins, "If peasants can do this, why not we?" The answer, as Frisia proved, was that they could, if they dared to imagine chains weren't destiny. The Volga River in 1670 became a flowing highway of rebellion, its waters carrying not just fish and trade goods, but the dreams of thousands who'd had enough. At the helm stood Stenka Razin, a Cossack leader whose name would echo through Russian history like a thunderclap, part folk hero, part revolutionary, and entirely dangerous to the Tsarist order. His uprising wasn't just another peasant revolt. It was a social earthquake that briefly cracked open the rigid hierarchy of Muscovy, revealing the molten fury beneath. What set Razin apart wasn't just his military skill, though his riverborne tactics outmaneuvered royal troops time and again, but his understanding of theater. He didn't just lead rebels, he staged spectacles. When his forces captured the wealthy town of Astrakhan, he didn't merely execute corrupt officials. He turned their trial into a public ritual, forcing them to wear the tattered clothes of beggars before throwing them from the city walls. This wasn't random cruelty, it was symbolic justice, a deliberate inversion of the social order that peasants across Russia heard about in hushed, hopeful tones. His most famous stunt, tossing a Persian princess into the Volga to prove no luxury could corrupt him, became legend not because it was true, historians debate if it happened, but because it perfectly captured his image as a man who valued fairness above finery. The rebellion's momentum came from an unlikely alliance. Cossacks, those semi-independent warrior communities of the southern steppes, joined forces with serfs who'd escaped brutal estate life. Razin promised something radical: land for those who worked it, freedom from crushing taxes, and an end to the bureaucracy that treated peasants like numbers in a ledger. His proclamations, read aloud in village squares by literate former monks, didn't just list grievances, they painted a vision. The Tsar is good, Razin claimed, but his boyars are wolves. This clever framing allowed peasants to rebel without feeling disloyal, directing their rage at corrupt officials rather than the distant figure of the Tsar himself. Military success came shockingly fast. Razin's fleet of stolen ships became floating fortresses, controlling the Volga with hit-and-run raids that left garrisons bewildered. At Simbirsk, his forces nearly broke through to Moscow itself, their numbers swelling with every liberated village. German mercenaries fighting for the Tsar wrote home in panic about an endless tide of ragged men who fight like devils, while Orthodox priests warned their flocks that Razin might be the Antichrist, proof of how deeply he threatened the establishment. Yet the revolt's collapse was as dramatic as its rise. Razin's charisma, so potent in victory, couldn't compensate for strategic weaknesses. His coalition fractured when promised reinforcements from Don Cossacks never arrived, trapped by early winter ice. Tsarist cannons, superior in open battle, shattered peasant formations at critical moments. Most fatally, Razin underestimated Moscow's ability to divide his supporters, offering pardons to minor rebels while hunting leaders relentlessly. When he was finally captured in 1671, his execution was designed for maximum psychological impact. Tortured on a scaffold in Red Square, then dismembered alive while crowds watched in silence. But here's what the Tsar's ministers failed to understand: you can kill a rebel, but not a story. Razin's defeat became the blueprint for later revolts. Pugachev would borrow his tactics in the 18th century. Bolsheviks would resurrect his image in 1917. The uprising's true legacy lies in the question it forced upon Russia's rulers: how long can you build an empire on the backs of people you treat as beasts? As one captured rebel reportedly told his interrogators before execution, "You hang us today, but who will plant your wheat tomorrow?" That uneasy silence between question and noose would haunt Russia for centuries to come. High in the snow-capped Alps, where narrow passes turned into natural death traps and every goat path became a strategic asset, the Tyrolean peasants waged a rebellion that defied all odds. While lowland revolts across Germany were being crushed in 1525, these mountain fighters held out with a tenacity that made emperors shudder. Their secret wasn't just courage, it was an intimate dance with geography. A shepherd who could navigate blizzards blindfolded could lead armored knights into avalanche zones. A dairymaid who knew which overhangs concealed caves could hide entire families from search parties. This was warfare rewritten by the land itself, where a well-placed rockslide could achieve what 1,000 pitchforks could not. What made the Tyrolean revolt unique was its fusion of ancient Alpine freedoms with radical new ideas from the Reformation. Peasant leaders like Michael Geismar, a former mining administrator turned revolutionary, didn't just demand lower taxes, they drafted constitutions envisioning a mountain republic where valleys governed themselves. Geismar's Landesordnung was a stunning document proposing elected judges, communal ownership of mines, and schools to teach peasant children Latin so they could challenge clerical lies. This wasn't mere rebellion, it was a blueprint for a society where the Highlanders' traditional independence met the Reformation's promise of spiritual equality. Their tactics were masterclasses in asymmetrical warfare. When Habsburg troops tried marching up valleys, rebels triggered pre-stacked log avalanches. Ambush parties camouflaged in white smocks blended into snowbanks before striking supply trains. Most brilliantly, they turned Catholic processions, once tools of oppression, into intelligence networks. Pilgrims smuggling messages in hollowed-out reliquaries, or nuns hiding rebel maps inside hymnals, proved that even the church's rituals could be weaponized. Yet the revolt's greatest strength, isolation, also spelled its doom. As lowland rebellions fell, the Habsburgs redirected seasoned mercenaries and siege engineers to the Alps. One by one, mountain strongholds were starved out or betrayed by collaborators bribed with salt monopolies. Geismar fled to Italy, only to be assassinated in 1532, his dream of an Alpine republic dying with him. But here's what the victors failed to erase: the legend of resilience. Future generations of Tyroleans would invoke 1525 during Napoleon's invasion, again in World War II's resistance movements. Modern special forces still study their terrain-based tactics. Most importantly, the revolt left an unanswered question hanging over every empire. How do you conquer people who know every crevice of their homeland better than you know your own throne room? As one Habsburg commander grumbled in his memoirs, "We won the valleys, but the peaks never surrendered." Long before Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door, England's countryside hummed with dangerous ideas whispered in barns, scribbled onto scraps of parchment, passed between calloused hands that knew more of scripture than most priests. These were the Lollards, a movement of peasants and tradesmen who dared to believe the Bible belonged to everyone, not just the Latin-speaking elite. Their name, derived from the Dutch word for mumbler, was a mocking label from authorities who feared what they couldn't control: ordinary people interpreting God's word for themselves. What began as an intellectual challenge by Oxford scholar John Wycliffe in the late 14th century became something far more radical when it reached the fields and workshops. Lollards didn't just question church corruption, they rejected the very hierarchy that crowned kings and popes alike, arguing that a plowman living in Christ's example stood closer to heaven than a jewel-bedecked bishop. The rebellion's power lay in its quiet persistence. Unlike explosive peasant revolts that burned bright and fast, the Lollard movement simmered for generations, adapting to suppression with remarkable resilience. When authorities banned Wycliffe's Bible translations, scribes produced tiny, concealable copies, some no larger than a palm, hidden in flour barrels or sewn into clothing. Village artisans memorized entire gospels to recite at secret nighttime gatherings in forests or limestone caves. Their most subversive tool, the English language itself. By rejecting Latin masses in favor of scripture in the vernacular, they democratized divinity, turning Sunday sermons into something any weaver or blacksmith could debate. Persecution only sharpened their influence. After the failed Lollard Uprising of 1414, a desperate march on London crushed by royal forces, the movement didn't die, it went underground. Weavers' looms became perfect hiding places for banned texts, the rhythmic clatter masking forbidden readings. Butchers and bakers developed coded language, using bread orders or meat cuts to signal safe houses. Even the church's own institutions were infiltrated. Sympathetic parish priests left church doors unlocked for midnight meetings, while friars sympathetic to the cause smuggled tracts in hollowed-out confessionals. This wasn't just resistance, it was an early blueprint for how marginalized groups could sustain dissent across generations. The Lollards' true impact reverberated long after their suppression. When the Protestant Reformation erupted a century later, reformers found England's soil already tilled by these underground radicals. Many of Wycliffe's ideas, denial of transubstantiation, rejection of papal authority, resurfaced in Lutheran and Calvinist teachings. More crucially, they'd proven that revolutionary ideas could spread without armies or noble patrons, carried on the tongues of itinerant laborers and midwives. Their legacy wasn't just theological, it was tactical. Future rebels from the pilgrimage of grace to the levelers would borrow their methods of clandestine organization and grassroots preaching. Perhaps the most profound testament to their influence lies in what they forced the powerful to acknowledge. Even at the movement's peak, Lollards never numbered more than a fraction of the population. Yet the panic they provoked, the burnings, the bans, the obsessive hunts for heretical texts revealed a chilling truth for elites. Ideas are harder to kill than people. As one bishop lamented in frustration after a public burning of Lollard writings, "We ash the pages, but the words take wing." That paradox would haunt every suppression to come, that the quieter the rebellion, the longer its shadow grows. The city of Münster in 1534 became a looking-glass world where everything feudal Europe knew as sacred was turned upside down. Tailors preached from pulpits, goldsmiths baptized babies in public fountains, and the bishop's palace became a communal storehouse where silk gowns were cut into equal shares for beggars. This was the Anabaptist rebellion, not just a revolt against taxes or lords, but an attempt to build heaven on earth through the most radical social experiment the medieval world had ever seen. At its heart stood a former innkeeper named Jan Matthys, who declared private property the original sin and promised his followers that in the New Jerusalem, even the cobblestones would testify to God's equality. What made Münster unique wasn't just its ideals, it was their ruthless implementation. Unlike peasant revolts that negotiated with kings, the Anabaptists acted with apocalyptic certainty. They welded the city gates shut, burned debt records in the cathedral square, and issued a decree that sent shockwaves through every royal court. All wealth was to be pooled, with city elders distributing food and clothing according to need. Even marriages were dissolved and reordered by lottery, as if to prove no human bond was beyond God's rearranging. For 16 dizzying months, Münster became a theocracy where the line between revelation and delirium blurred daily, where bakers saw visions and street sweepers debated theology with the fervor of university scholars. The siege that followed was medieval Europe's first total war. Bishop Franz von Waldeck, watching his own city slip into heresy, hired mercenaries from 3 kingdoms to starve the rebels out. But Münster's defenders, many of them illiterate weavers and tanners, turned their city into a fortress of divine ingenuity. They repurposed church bells as cannonballs, melted down silver reliquaries to make bullets, and dug tunnels beneath siege lines to steal supplies. When the bishop's forces dammed the river to cut off water, the Anabaptists dug wells in secret cellars, singing hymns to mask the sound of pickaxes. Their resilience wasn't just military, it was performative, a living theater to prove God favored the righteous. Yet the rebellion's unraveling was as dramatic as its rise. Matthys, convinced he was invincible, marched out with 30 men to part the siege like Moses did the Red Sea, and was promptly hacked to pieces. His successor, the charismatic Jan van Leyden, escalated the revolution into surreal extremes, declaring himself King of Zion, instituting polygamy, and executing dissenters with a zeal that mirrored the tyranny they'd rebelled against. By the time Betrayal opened the gates in 1535, Münster's streets echoed with starvation chants rather than hymns of triumph. The aftermath became a warning etched in blood. Van Leyden and his lieutenants were tortured with red-hot tongs for days before their corpses were hung in iron cages from St. Lambert's Church, where their bones still rattled in the wind decades later. But the cage's true audience wasn't the rebels. It was every peasant who might dream of overturning God's ordained order. Protestant and Catholic rulers alike pointed to Münster as proof that social upheaval led straight to madness, a narrative that would stain radical movements for centuries. Beneath the horror, though, lies an unanswered question. Was this truly fanaticism, or a doomed attempt to live the Sermon on the Mount literally? The Anabaptists' dream, shared wealth, egalitarian rule, spiritual directness, would resurface in Quaker colonies and communalist movements across history. Even their failures taught brutal lessons about power's corrupting force, whether wielded by bishops or self-proclaimed kings of Zion. As one surviving Anabaptist scribbled before execution, "We planted vines in the ruins, but the world wasn't ready for the wine." That vintage, bitter and potent, would keep fermenting in hidden corners of the radical imagination long after Münster's cages rusted empty. Peasant revolts burned bright across medieval Europe, yet time and again, their flames were smothered not by some inevitable law of history, but by recurring weaknesses that doomed even the most passionate uprisings. The first fatal flaw lay in coordination. Unlike professional armies with clear hierarchies, peasant forces often fractured along village lines, their localized loyalties making continent-spanning change impossible. Take the German Peasants' War. Thousands rose up independently across regions, but without unified command, they became easy prey for nobles who picked them off piecemeal. Even the brilliantly organized Hussites, with their war wagons and trained militias, eventually splintered between moderates and radicals, proving that internal divisions could be deadlier than any external enemy. Yet coordination alone couldn't guarantee victory against the second obstacle, the establishment's willingness to escalate brutality beyond all moral limits. When nobles felt their privileges threatened, they responded with theatrical cruelty designed to sear rebellion from collective memory. The aftermath of the Hungarian Dózsa revolt wasn't just suppression. It was a grotesque performance where leaders were force-fed their own roasted flesh, sending a message that resonated for generations. Authorities understood that to crush rebellions, they had to break more than bodies. They had to shatter the very idea that change was possible. This psychological warfare worked with chilling efficiency. After the Jacquerie massacres, French peasants wouldn't dare challenge the nobility for over a century. The greatest tragedy, though, lay in the missed opportunities, those moments when history teetered on a knife's edge. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 came agonizingly close when rebels held London and forced the king to negotiate. Had Wat Tyler's demands been institutionalized rather than betrayed, serfdom might have ended 3 centuries earlier. Similarly, if the Catalonian peasants of 1640 had secured lasting alliances with Barcelona's merchants, Spain's centralization might have fractured permanently. These near successes reveal an uncomfortable truth. Feudalism's survival depended less on divine right than on rebels lacking that one final push. What makes these failures so poignant is how they collectively forged the modern world. Each crushed rebellion left behind embers ideas about equality that resurfaced in the Enlightenment, tactics of resistance that inspired later revolutions. The 12 Articles of the German peasants became a prototype for human rights declarations. The Frisian experiments with self-governance echoed in democratic constitutions. Even in defeat, these uprisings forced elites to make concessions, lowering taxes, easing serfdom, proving that while peasants rarely won outright, their unrest could bend the arc of history. Imagine a world where just one of these revolts had triumphed completely. Would we have seen a medieval republic rise from the ashes of the Taborite movement? Might the Ermendinho's demolished castles have given way to a Galician peasant state? The rebellion's true legacy isn't in their outcomes, but in the haunting question they left hanging over every throne. If power truly comes from the people, how long can you rule against their will? As a surviving Lollard once scrawled on a prison wall, "They break our bodies like bread, but who will bake the next loaf?" That silent calculation between oppression and endurance remains history's most volatile equation. From the muddy fields of feudal Europe to the frozen rivers of Muscovy, these peasant uprisings carved a hidden path through history, not with crowns and treaties, but with scythes sharpened on the whetstone of desperation. While kings and chroniclers dismissed them as fleeting riots, the truth cuts deeper. Every time serfs burned a tax ledger or farmers raised a stolen sword, they proved the unthinkable, that thrones don't rest on divine right, but on the fragile patience of those who kneel before them. The Jacquerie's torches, the Taborites' war wagons, the Ermendinho's demolished castles, these weren't just acts of rage, but experiments in a world without lords. Consider the astonishing ripple effect of these failed revolts. When French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille in 1789, they channeled the same fury that once animated the salt smugglers of Gascony. Lenin's Bolsheviks studied Stenka Razin's riverborne tactics, while the Catalan rebels of 1640 foreshadowed modern independence movements. Even the Bunch's secret symbols chalked on barn doors and woven into folk songs anticipated underground resistance networks from Warsaw to Selma. The irony is rich. Regimes that crushed peasant rebellions often fell to later revolutions armed with their very playbooks. What makes these stories endure isn't just their drama, but their unresolved questions. Would Wat Tyler have succeeded had he distrusted the king's promises? Could the Taborites have sustained their radical commune without turning on each other? History offers no easy answers, only haunting glimpses of roads not taken. The true legacy of these uprisings lies in their exposure of power's illusion, that for all their pomp, empires tremble when the hands that plant their wheat decide to grasp swords instead. So the next time you walk past an ordinary marketplace or plough-scarred field, pause. Beneath that unremarkable soil lie bones and whispers of those who dared to imagine a fairer world. Their defeats were never total because every rebellion, no matter how brutally suppressed, plants seeds in minds that outlived tyrants. As a defiant Lollard once scrawled on his prison wall before execution, "They burn the page but not the story." Now it's your turn to carry these stories forward. Which revolt left you awestruck? Share your thoughts below and join us next time as we unearth more buried chapters of courage. The past's rebels may be gone, but their echoes still rattle every throne that forgets where true power lies.